Welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Spellman, and I'm an agronomy educator with Penn State Extension, and I'm joined here with my co-host and colleague, Justin Brackenrich. How are you doing today, Justin?
Good, Ryan. How about yourself?
Oh, living the dream. We have two episodes this week, and
Ba-ba-ba!
a double header. And so this is a bonus episode. So we brought our best and brightest here today. We have two other extension educators on our team to join us to talk about both silage dry down this year and crop condition and a summary of our crop condition tour where the educators kind of go out and assess crop productivity, especially corn and soybean. Okay.
So I'd kind of file this as like somewhere along that ag innovations, right? This kind of goes in the background of things that we've got people that are working really hard to do, but they're not always things that get like pushed to the front that people know that we're doing, right? Like we've got all these researchers or like Zach that we're going to talk to in his silage dry down, and Heidi and her initiative that she takes in this statewide cropping tour, and the educators and the industry people and all the ones that go out to do this. It's just one more level of what all these folks are doing across the state that comes out in an article. Zach's is kind of periodic, where Heidi's is once. And it just, we're trying to get people to realize how much work all of these specialists and all of these educators are doing and the value of all of these resources that we put out here. And so, not trying to say that we do a whole bunch of work, but like just bringing it out here of how much is available to the people and can see what's available as a resource to the producers across the state.
Fair, well said, Justin. Yeah, me and you might not do a whole lot, but the rest of the team gets a
My
lot
days are spent
done.
podcasting.
Yeah, we just waste our time on this platform, but hopefully we can bring you some positive messages and some information about what everyone else is doing through this. Outside of an article, this is kind of a cool format to do that. So I guess we'll get right into the meat and potatoes of this, or I guess the corn and soybean of this. And we'll first introduce Heidi, and she's going to talk a little bit about the crop condition tour that we put on every year, and we just wrapped up, maybe a month ago now.
Yeah, that month went fast, didn't it? Well, hello. This is my first time on the podcast. My name is Heidi Reed. I'm an extension agronomy educator based in York County. I cover York and Adams, part of Cumberland County, and also go where I'm needed. So I'm going to be talking about the statewide crop conditions tour today.
And Heidi mentioned it was her first time, and she told us before we started she was a little maybe bummed, maybe bittersweet that she wasn't on the first time to talk about cover crops. So I think that opens her up to come back on for another episode, is what I'm hearing there.
I'll beat that drum all day.
Yeah. So will you start with just kind of explaining, we've said the cover crop condition tour or the yield tour, whatever we want to call it. Will you just talk a little bit about what that means to us or the history of this project or how you inherited that?
Sure. So I actually had to reach out to a former Penn State Extension educator to get the backstory. The crop conditions tour started in 2018 at the urging of the infamous Del Voigt to Zach Larson, who was an agronomy educator for several years based in Blair County. And so it started in 2018, and the effort is essentially to get out in the fields and assess what we can expect farmers to see at harvest. So we do a fair bit of monitoring as extension educators, especially with the soybean sentinel plots. We have fields that we go back to weekly or bi-weekly and keep a really close eye on, but that's typically 2 to 3 fields per person. Maybe if someone covers multiple counties, one field per county that they're covering. And there's just no way that we can have a good grasp on what's going on across the state if those are the only fields we're keeping a close eye on. So this tour gives us a chance to get into some additional fields, get out on different farms that we may not have included in the soybean board sentinel monitoring project, or may not be farmer cooperators who we are familiar with what their crop fields look like and their yield expectations are. And yeah, we just get out there and look at pests that have been present in the growing season, We do yield estimates for corn. We do pod counts for soybeans. And then the farmer at the location where we have stopped can have an idea of what to expect when they start up the combine. And when we summarize all these data across the state and by region, our co-ops or our grain elevators can have an idea of the quantity and quality of grain that's going to be coming in on those truckloads. So it's good for the farmers. I think it's good for agronomists to be able to work together and share what we're seeing across the state. And I do think that the grain buyers are also have their eyes on this report.
Yeah, as Heidi mentioned, I think this is it's for me, it's an exciting week. It's a busy week that we get to go out there and do these, but it kind of fills up your week. You get to see a lot of different, for me, covering multiple counties, you get to see different climates and different fields, and you see a lot of variability. And I think this year I saw a lot of variability across these fields, and it was a great way to connect with farmers that I don't work with every day, see crops from people who have different management strategies as well. Can you talk a little bit about kind of before we get into some of the details of this with the bushels per acre and such? Could you talk just general observations this year? Were you able to extract anything statewide that really jumps out at you when we're talking about corn?
Yes. So actually, corn and soybeans both, we noticed that the earlier those crops were planted, the worse condition they are in, the lower the yield potential coming out of the field. So the later they were planted, the higher our yield estimates were, just because of timing of that hot and dry period in July through August, and how that lined up with the important growth stages for determining the yield components and specifically pollination.
And
So
I'm assuming
early,
that's like a relative term on early planting, right? So in, Lancaster, your area, that's much different in early planting compared to me kind of moving west, or was it everything across the board earlier than May?
oh, that's a good question. So I don't know, Justin.
We can edit
I
that out. That's
could
fine.
I don't think I can distill that. So yeah, right, in York and Lancaster and Lebanon County, early planting is mid-April. And I know we did see some fields in the west that were seeded that early in the third or fourth week of April. So I would say it's in general stuff that was going in mid-April through early May is not going to have a very high yield potential this fall.
So our friends in Ohio have had their Battle of the Belt research for the last 2 years, where they're looking at, some of their planting times and dates, and maybe that should be some folks we bring in to talk to on this, because even where I'm at, it's like a polarizing thing of some farmers are adamant beans before corn, some are the opposite of corns before beans, and I've heard some say I plant whatever I ended on the end of the year, right? So I don't have to reset my planter to go the other direction. So every other year we start with something different. So it always changes as to what we're going with first when it starts with planting season.
I guess that's one way to spread your risk. Just flip flop every year. Yes, and that is a great segue. That's another observation that I can say across crops, corn and soybeans, and across the whole state. Slugs were bad this year and impacted crop populations, which therefore impacted final yield estimates for corn and the pod estimates for soybeans.
So, Heidi, not to put you on the spot on any particular detail here, but did you notice just in my observation, I found with this kind of this slug damage that affected the populations, I saw that a lot more in soybeans. Earlier in the year, just visually seeing where am I seeing a lot of slug damage, it was soybean and it was most obvious. Did you see population stands reduced in corn as well? Was this kind of a story of both corn and soybean?
I would say more than any other year since I started in 2018 and participated in the tour in 2018. yes, slugs impacted both crops more than we would expect. And you're right, soybeans are typically bearing the brunt of the damage and including seeds being eaten. That's not necessarily just talking about crop damage to emerge plants, feeding on leaves. The seeds are actually eaten, but we saw it with both this year, and they're in, at least in my region, almost every grain farmer I talk with had at least one field replanted, if not multiple fields replanted multiple times. So yeah, it was bad across the board, and I do think that's reflected in the yield estimates, and I can add some nuance to that as we get into the regional report.
So I want to jump into corn, and I'll admit I'm cheating. I've got the corn report and the bean report article pulled up here. So I'm not going to pretend to know all this stuff, and we'll make sure we get the link to this put in the show notes so that anyone wants to go back and hop into this. And maybe this is a great time to plug the field crop news, and maybe we'll put a link in there for field crop news, because that's where both of these articles would be generated and put out through for your looking. But specifically, I'm looking at corn, and we've got this broken into some regions. But why don't we start with just like, what did you see when you separated these regions? What kind of constitutes the West or the Northern tier, the Central? How do you break those up?
We base the regions are similar every year, but not identical. So it is not based off of regions shown in the agronomy guide or regions used by the Corn Growers Association or by the Pennsylvania Soybean Board. They're based more on how the production year was in the region. So for instance, this year, the northern tier had weather that was significantly different from the rest of the state, and the west had weather that was significantly different from the rest of the state. And so we drew those lines essentially kind of based on how the weather was. Like the drought was really bad in that Bedford, Somerset, Fulton county region. That was all lumped into the west. Whereas it also depends in a given year where we have coverage from educators, because as we've done this for 6 years, people come and go, and we don't always have representation in all of the regions. And for instance, last year, Justin, I think there was, or maybe 2 years ago, there was one educator in all of the West, and it's not fair to necessarily summarize a region based on two counties. So it varies year by year, but the Southeast is typically your heaviest ag areas, the Lancaster, York, Adams, Lebanon, Berks, that area. And then Central, sometimes we may put Dauphin, Perry into Southeast, and sometimes that might be lumped in with the Central region. So it varies year by year.
So I'm kind of keyed into the West. I'm sure, Ryan, you might specifically focus more on the Central, but I'm looking back. So we've got data from 24, 23, 22, 21, and 20.
Mhm.
And the average in the West this year was 119 bushels per acre. The worst other beside that was 2020, and that seems to be fairly significant, as 2020 was kind of bad everywhere else. I don't remember 2020 being a bad year. Was it? I guess that wasn't that long ago, and I didn't recognize that as being this drought or wet or a very stressful year. Maybe I'm not remembering well enough, but it doesn't stick out in my head to be that big of a problem compared to some of the other years that we've had. So maybe that's just for posterity or some of you that are listening to think about, is what happened to your place at 2020. But what did you see when you started looking, as you were grouping the West, comparing? I know that you've got an irrigated bushels here at 226, so that's pretty good corn. But what did you think about how you separated out these regions that we called them?
So certainly taking a look at that drought monitor map and the rainfall, the precipitation departures map from NOAA gives us a pretty good. There's a natural break, right, with the mountain ranges where we go from the Piedmont, down in the southeast, and then work our way up, kind of diagonally across the state. But yeah, we didn't necessarily cherry pick the higher producing fields to include in the southeast, for instance. There's a plenty of uh, data coming out of York and Adams where our soil types are not as forgiving as Lancaster and Lebanon, where even though we're lumped into that southeast, our yields were pretty significantly lower than average. And then northern tier, we had four counties: Carbon County, Lackawanna, Potter, and Wyoming. So those are pretty clearly up there in the north. The central region was Blair, Cambria, Center, Columbia, and Northumberland. Let's see, we had Adams, Chester, Dauphin, Lancaster, Lebanon, Montgomery, Perry, and York in the southeast. And then in the west, Bedford, Fayette, Franklin was included in the west just because of that drought that was experienced this year. Greene and Washington.
So I know that when I was working on this project, we part of this is to sample the ears, and there's a mathematical thing, right? So I'm trying to explain this, and I always talk with my hands, recognizing that people can't see what I'm doing, right? But you shuck back your ear, you count the rows, then you count the rings around it, right? To rows and columns, and then you can multiply that out to get the kernels per cob. We take a designated section depending on what your rows, like your inches per row is, and then we can mathematically calculate that's basically ears per row in that section, and then that translates to ears per acre, and then that goes to kernels per ear, and so on and so forth. And that's where this comes from, right? And there's some other gyrations that occur there, but anyone can do this. This doesn't something that's like incredibly difficult science. It's just a pen and paper and a calculator that you can really find some pretty easy fact sheets online that give you the ability to go out and take these own kind of equations. But the other really cool part about this is you're looking at some of these ears, and detrimentally maybe to the farmer or some of the other people, when we see these really stressful times and some of these things, we see some pretty wild looking ears of corn, and we see some tipping back, we see some tassel ears, we see all of this other stuff. Did you see a lot of interesting ears? I know Leanna had some stuff out of Bedford that was really far behind in blister. Talk about any of that stuff you saw, if you'd like to mention that, and maybe encourage some folks to go out and observe what their ears look like before they run them through the combine here in a week or two.
Sure. So certainly the drought was the main factor that was impacting the tip back. So that's when we have, incomplete pollination and there's not fully developed kernels the whole way from butt to tip of the ear. We do lose, first of all, a lot of yield from that, right? So that reduces the number of that portion of the yield component formula. We have fewer rows of kernels per ear of corn. So we take a hit there. The reasoning why that happened is dependent on when in the crop's physiological growth it was impacted by the drought. So depending on if it was late vegetative, where we're setting the number of rows around, so like the circumference of kernels, or the length, which is also late vegetative, to whether the drought was when the corn was in the early reproductive stages, when that pollen tube was just, shriveled up and the pollen never had a chance to actually fertilize that kernel. So, yeah, another thing I wanted to mention, and Ryan might be more of the expert here, was I know a concern is the mycotoxin. Since we did have the drought, we had a lot of farmers making the decision to hold back on some of those inputs like fungicides and insecticides. So we had more feeding on the ear tips, and B, more basically pathogen growth because those fungicides weren't necessarily out there. And so there were some pretty nasty looking ear diseases in addition to small ears, very few kernels around, very short ears, and then diseased ears on top of it.
Yeah, so to add to that, since you kind of teed me up here, yes, it was an interesting year when it comes to those mycotoxin issues. I haven't seen a lot of data yet, obviously, on what mycotoxins are present. We'll figure that out when people start to bring their grain to market. But what you were mentioning here about the tip, the tip opening, poor pollination, it kind of gave a path of entry for insects, which further allowed fungal spores to germinate. And I did see some fields, at least in my area, that were just seemed to be devastated by fungal disease, which is kind of unique because at the time of pollination, at the time where the tips would be kind of open, it was droughty. So usually you would think that a lot of our ear molds, usually we think of Fusarium graminearum is a big one around here, which causes the production of vomitoxin. That's our big concern here. That's usually not a fungus that thrives in wet and dry conditions. It kind of needs a more moist condition. So the unique thing is I saw a lot of fungi that we wouldn't normally consider in our area. I saw a lot of Fusarium ear rots that release some mycotoxins called fumonisins that are carcinogenic that some places test for, some don't. I think we're going to see some unique mycotoxins this year because we got a lot of fungi that thrive in dry and hot conditions, right? Those tips were open and fungi that like those conditions, those droughty conditions did well, which is unique for this area. We usually don't have that. So I did see a lot of fungal damage. It wasn't necessarily the species that we usually expect here in Pennsylvania. I did hear of some reports of some aspergillus, which are more of a southern mycotoxin as well. So I would expect when we get to the point where folks are bringing their grain to market, we might see some unique things when it comes to mycotoxins. Now, that's just kind of observational.
I will say, if I may, Justin, the flip side of that coin is some of the cleanest leaves I've ever seen. The foliar diseases were just not out there. We expect to see gray leaf spot and northern cornleaf blight every single year in basically every field. Now we have hybrids out there with resistance to those being planted across the Commonwealth, but we still see them at low, non-economic levels. And there was basically just nothing,
Yeah.
I think, on account of the dry weather. So that was really interesting, and the first time in my short career so far that I had seen that clean of foliar canopy.
Yeah, certainly. And I think a lot of those foliar fungi thrive in moist conditions, and we just didn't have those conditions. And so I had a lot of conversation with farmers otherwise, and we were talking about spraying. I said, your limiting factor is not disease this year. Your limiting factor is drought. Any disease that you do see, it's limited. And by the time it's really picking up, we're seeing more moist conditions now, but dry down's already occurring naturally. So it's not going to really, usually foliar diseases lead to premature dry down, which is the problem. So I would reflect that same observation. So I think we've covered corn pretty well here. And if for our listeners, if you want to do more of a dive and look at the yield numbers this year compared to other years, I think the moral of the story, reductions in corn yield across the board, maybe in the northern tier, it wasn't as reduced. They had more moisture than the rest of the state this year. So they're looking more average, but across the board, a lot of droughty conditions leading to poor yields. So with that, why don't we jump into soybeans? So can you talk a little bit about just general trends you saw in soybean this year? And also maybe you can talk a little bit about, I know soybeans can be a little bit more difficult to estimate. So maybe you can talk about what we do to estimate those yields.
Sure. So in the past, as Zach Larson, who started this effort, attempted a couple of different protocols for estimating soybean yield. So there's the 1/1000th of an acre method, which is essentially the same that we use for corn yield estimates, where for 30-inch rows, you're measuring 17 feet 5 inches because that is 1/1000th of an acre in square feet. You're counting the number of plants, and then for soybeans, you count up the number of pods, the number of beans per pod, and you're doing your best to estimate the size, the density of the soybean, or the size of the soybean, number of beans per bushel. And then you figure out the yield that way. We also attempted the hula hoop method, which tends to work a little better for narrower rows, which, at least in my part of the world, I don't think I know anybody who's growing 30-inch soybeans. It's very, very rare down here, mostly drilled or 15-inch soybeans. So we moved away from both of those methods because we could never, we were just finding them to be incredibly inaccurate. There was, 30 to 40 bushel plus or minus compared to what the yield monitor was saying. And for that reason, we couldn't in good conscience continue to share these yield estimates and then be that wrong. So I think the main issue there was the narrower the rows, the greater variability in, like, you look at 3 feet of row in a drilled soybean field. You could have one plant in 3 feet, or you could have 15 plants in 3 feet. Just the nature of the drill. It's really high variability, and so without incredible amounts of replication, it's just an inaccurate stand count essentially, and then everything else is off from the jump there. And in addition to the issue with the narrower rows and getting good estimates there is so much that can happen between last week of August, and harvest, especially with soybeans. So in some instances, there's still a lot of pod fill that needs to happen, depending on where you are in the state and what your relative maturity of your bean is, and how mature it is at that time. There's a lot of shrink that occurs between that nice plump edamame looking bean and your dry 13.5% harvestable soybean. And it's really tough to know what factor you should use as your multiplier for your seed size when it's really plump compared to when it's dry. There's just a lot of guesswork, and we have decided we're more comfortable just going with pod counts per acre compared to trying to guess yield per acre. And then what we saw in terms of soybean condition, like, obviously the soybeans were also impacted by the drought in the southeast and the western part of the state specifically. However, in terms of number of pods that were developed per plant, we didn't see big differences from the last 4 years. We're kind of stable, except in the West, we were down significantly. So just in 2023, for example, we counted 5.2 million pods per acre on average in the Western region, and we were down to 4.0 million pods per acre this year. So that is significant, more than 20% reduction in pods. In the southeast, we were right on par. In the northern tier, they had significantly more pods this year than in prior years, and that could be on account of the amount of moisture they got and the good growing season they got up there relatively, that Zach can talk about. And then in the center region, central part of the state, we counted 5.3 million pods per acre this year compared to 6.6 million pods per acre last year. So we're down there, but yeah, in the central region, I guess I'm not scouting fields there. So maybe Ryan, you would have more of a point of view from why we would have seen reduced pods there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. When we look at the chart, it's reduced based on 2023 numbers. So 2023, we saw an average of 6.6 million. And then when you look at the 5.3 and if you look at all the dates back to 2020, the 5.3 is actually still slightly above average to average. So I think when you compare it to last year we had a banner year for soybeans. Last year we had great. I saw a small. There were small beans, but a lot of podding, a lot of 4 bean pods. So I think that's kind of where we're seeing this difference. When I was looking at scouting soybeans, what I noticed physiologically going on this year was that the soybeans started setting pods really early. So, or because they were in that drought, so they started maybe not setting pods necessarily, but flowering earlier on and lower to the ground. And so that kind of just continued throughout the season. And so I saw a lot of pods on real small plants. My question with this though, when we actually get to the end of the season, are we going to see that all of those pods are harvestable because they're so low to the ground? And yeah, there's a lot of fill that's still to happen. So the plants were looking strange this year, but I'd say an average amount of pod set to above average. But last year was just a banner year for them, so it really kind of throws everything out of whack.
So my funny story with the crop condition tour is that Heidi has mentioned bean counts, right? And you've got or pod counts within your beans, and you've got this like varying factor of whether it's a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4. And we use an average of 2.5 beans per pod when we're making these kind of pod count estimates. Um, my first year that I did this would have probably been 2018, so maybe one of the very beginning years. I pulled every pod off of every plant and put it in a Ziploc bag and took them home with me and sat. Caitlin helped me. We sat and watched football on Sunday afternoon and we counted every pod off of every bean plant. And I think the average was something like 2.49. I mean, it was incredibly close. Like statistically couldn't have been different from 2.5, right? I mean, it was so close. And the hours that we spent sorting these thousands of pods was amazing because you're talking 3 pods per sample or 3 plants per sample, somewhere between you could have 80 pods on a plant or you could have 6, right? Like there's no way of knowing. But it was just a tremendous amount of effort to find out that it was just negligible differences that year, I guess, that season between 2.5 and something else. So let that be a lesson that it's just 2.5 is a fine number to use.
Use the book value.
That's
Yeah.
right. You trusted on that occasion.
But you proved it, so there we go.
I mean, I'm comfortable with that number forever now. Yeah, I think that's one of those things. I've logged the hours. I'm good with that moving forward, and I never have to do it again. So the last thing I would ask, Heidi, is there anything else that you think we need to know about the crop condition tour? Could people get involved? What could we do to help you? Anything else you want to tell us about this tour?
Sure. So the crop conditions tour is definitely improved the more people who participate in it. And I would say if you're interested, reach out to your local agronomy educator. This takes place the last week in August every year. We have some flexibility, but we try to get in, August 25th through September 1st. Reach out to your local educator. We have had farmers participate, agronomists, crop scouts, millers, grain brokers. The press has gotten involved. It's just, first of all, great community building and networking opportunity, as well as a great to see the crops grown in your region, have an idea of what's going on out there besides what you read from us every week in the field crop news. So yeah, we really welcome more participation. And if you would like us to tour your farm as a farmer, certainly reach out to your educator. I sure hope you know who's your closest agronomy educator to call, and we'll pay you a visit and tour your field.
Great, thanks, Heidi. I think that was a cool way to kind of look at the season before we get into the harvest season. And for sure, it definitely helps a lot when you have other hands to help you out. So definitely second that. If you're in Blair, Cambria County, or Huntingdon, let me know. You can come join me. There's my plug. Okay, so Zack Curtis has been waiting in the wings very patiently. He might have taken a nap or two, but he's here now, and he's going to join us to talk about silage condition this season and dry down across the state.
Hello, guys. Thanks for having me here today to talk a little bit about the silage dry down for this year.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Zack. So why don't you talk about where you are in the state, first of all, and then talk about where this silage project has come from and what you guys do.
Yeah, so I'm a agronomy educator based out of Wayne County. I work with a lot of crop producers in northeastern Pennsylvania. I think a lot of our crop production in the north seems to still be forage based because we still have quite a bit of our crop product going to feed livestock. Because of that, I find a lot of time working with silages and halages and different forage based products. This effort kind of came about long before me. Several extension members who have since retired. Basically, the idea was that they would just collect corn samples from around the state. They would chip them up, put them on a dryer, and see what the moisture content was at that point in time and report it. So that way everybody in the state, especially the people in their local area, knew what the moisture content of that silage was. Moisture and proper harvest moisture is so important for harvesting a good quality silage. There's a lot of things that depend on the right moisture at harvest. The first being the fiber content and the digestibility of the fiber in that plant. And the second would be the starch content and the digestibility of that starch in that plant. Typically in silage, we figure that half of the dry matter in that plant comes from the plant itself and the other half comes from the ear. So the idea of harvesting at the correct moisture is to try to strike a compromise between those two portions of the plant. And then the other reason that moisture is really important is because it ensures a really high quality fermentation. If we chop too wet, we'll have Clostridia bacteria, we'll have leaching and nutrient seepage. Can be really problematic in upright silos if we have a lot of leachate coming out of the silo. And then if we harvest too dry, we have problems with packing. We can have a lot of mold and yeast activity in that silage and see a lot of nutrient loss through heating. So we try to make sure that we harvest at the right moisture, and hopefully we can keep producers updated on the condition of the crop around the state.
So we mentioned that this is a kind of double header week for us, and the one that we're releasing this with is with Joe Lawrence from Cornell, right? So we've got, this pairs really well with this to have this discussion, right? And so for those maybe didn't listen to that one first, Joe Lawrence does a lot of silage research, and what we got into him was, how do we take what we've done this year, how do we learn from that over the course of the feeding season, and how do we make adjustments to do differently with our silage next year, right? Zach's going to tell us why this happened or how that we knew this happened, but our silage happened a little faster this year than maybe we have in the past, or at least it did in my area. Maybe Zach can tell us about the rest of the state, but how can we use that as a learning opportunity to kind of put this together? So I wanted to set that stage for you, Zach, and to know that everything that we're talking about here has a really nice backdrop on that one with him as well. So one question that I have always had about silage is, last year, so I'm going to maybe talk a little bit more for ask question. Last year we had this problem of silage corn not drying down well at all, right? We were heat units short, we would say. This year we were in kind of an excess of heat units, and so things maybe got there faster than we thought. If you're this producer or you're starting this project, how do you know when it's time to start checking your corn? Do you just like go out August 1st and start checking every week? Because how are you supposed to get a good feel for this?
Yes, our optimum moisture Of course, it depends a lot on your farm and your management system. Ideally, we want a moisture somewhere between about 60 to 65%. Now, when that plant early on in the season is standing there, its moisture content is probably a lot closer to 80% relative moisture. And so we need to identify a time when we have typically a lower ear moisture and a higher plant moisture, so that way we can kind of marry the two together, the right moisture content. So a lot of times that comes with ear development sometime after the blister stage or that R4 stage, but it's going to be usually about a month after tasseling or silking is when
So
we're
if
going to.
I'm a corn producer, I don't keep track. And the next thing you're going to do is explain to me what a growing degree day is. But if I'm not keeping track of any of this stuff, if I wake up and I look out and I see my corn is tasseled and I mark that day on the calendar, and if I go 30 days from that day and put a check mark, I should start checking my moisture about that period in time. That's a good place to start.
It's a good place to start,
Okay.
and it can vary depending on how much.
No, you said it was a good place to start. Now,
You're telling me you don't even go out and look at your corn.
well, I am scouting 255.
Well, I suppose let's back up a minute and let's talk about growing degree days, since we're headed in that direction. Growing degree days are a way that we can track the physiological development or the maturity of a crop. The nice thing about corn is that it's really close. Its development is really closely tied to the amount of growing degree days that we accumulate. The way that we calculate it is by taking the recorded high temperature for the day. We add the recorded low temperature for the day. We take those two numbers, add them together, and divide it by 2. So that way we get the average temperature for that day. And then we subtract that average temperature from the base temperature that corn requires to grow. So corn doesn't grow below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and it doesn't grow any faster above 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So we kind of work within those two boundaries to say that, okay, if our daily temperature, if our daily high was 80 degrees and our daily low was 60 degrees, 80 plus 60 is 140, divided by 2 is 70 degrees. That's our average daily temperature. I then subtract the base cutoff of 50 degrees from that to find that we accumulated 20 growing degrees days that day. So most corn hybrids that we grow in Pennsylvania between 95 and 110 day relative maturity need somewhere between 2,000 and 2,200 growing degree days to reach that magical silage maturity. It doesn't hold out perfectly, but generally speaking, we need 2,000 to 2,200 growing degree days in one season from the day that we plant that seed up until we're ready to chop it.
And so what you and your team are doing are you're starting at that front end of 1800-ish. You're tracking that, which for the rest of us that don't like doing math as much as Zach does, there are apps and computer programs, right, that you can use to put in your physical location that can help you track your growing degree days. Unless you really like to sit there and keep track of your temperature and subtract all of this stuff every night before you go to bed. But you can accumulate that stuff. And then somewhere what Zach and his group are doing is they're going at about this 1800 mark and they're now chopping this corn and they're monitoring this and kind of giving us this regional aspect of what it looks like kind of across the state based on different hybrids.
Yeah, it's okay. I don't like doing math either. I use apps myself, so don't let me give you any false ideas here. But no, I'm looking here from our data that we collected this year. For most locations, especially south of I-80, we started monitoring a lot of these locations at around 1,800 growing degree days. Then we tracked them all the way through every week. Educators around the state went out, collected more samples, chipped them up, dried them out, and then reported the moisture content back. I then went through and tracked the growing degree day accumulations for those locations. And we tried to look for a correlation between moisture content at that location and growing degree day accumulation. But this year was kind of an oddity with the way the temperature and moisture levels changed from our 10-year averages. So it's a little bit difficult. It's not super precise, but I think if we do enough years of this year over year, we can start to gather some good trends to help point us in the direction, and hopefully learn from this in the future to see how we can better predict corn harvest in Pennsylvania.
So to kind of continue this conversation about growing degree days here and kind of connect it back to what you saw for dry down this year and then in previous years, did you confirm that GDD was predictive of the rate of dry down? Or, this year, I think we've already kind of talked a little bit about that. We saw dry down occurring earlier, people pulling silage off earlier than expected. Do we have a higher amount of accumulated GDD earlier in the season? And could you compare that to last year? Because I know briefly talking before this and in other conversations, we also had a weird year last year with GDD, and I won't bury the leader there. So I'll go back to you, Zach, on this one.
Yeah, so I'll step back to 2023. Most of us, especially the hay producers, remember that between the wildfire smoke that we had last year, it was really hard to get sunlight and all that infrared heat into Pennsylvania to help keep things warm, especially early on in the growing season. And then once that all cleared up, then we were overtaken by rain. But last year was just a cool, wet year, comparatively speaking, for Pennsylvania. Because of that, I think quite a few parts of the state saw later than normal silage harvest because we didn't have all that heat that we usually have. It didn't get warm as early, and it didn't stay warm in the parts of the season where we usually expect it to be warm. You compare that to this year, where a good portion of the growing season was hotter than normal and it was drier than normal, and we saw faster than normal rates of growing degree day accumulation. So all in all, we've kind of gone from one end of the spectrum to the other in the past 2 years. And it definitely keeps producers on their toes when it comes time to figuring out when it's the right time to start our harvest. That being said, we did notice a trend. I don't want to say yet that it's a prediction, but there is a strong correlation that our whole plant moisture does in fact decrease as our growing degree day accumulation increases. Generally speaking, we saw that most of our hybrids were at 65% moisture, somewhere between 2,000 and 2,200 growing degree days. The exception to this was up here in the north. I was monitoring a field that was planted here in Wayne County, and since it was a shorter day hybrid and it was planted quite a bit later than the rest of them, it took a few fewer growing degree days to reach that target moisture than some of the other locations did. And we had adequate moisture to keep that higher in that plant.
Yeah, so you kind of mentioned about how in your area it differed than other parts of the state, and you guys also use some different maturities in the northern tier than we might even in the center or the southeast. So I know you did have a few different locations. Did you see anything overall that there were certain areas that is it fair to assume that dry down will occur earlier the more southeast you go and then later the more north, or is there this tie-in with it's really about the growing degree days and the variety that you choose?
I think it's incredibly hybrid specific. So years ago, I remember folks telling me, well, we'd start chopping when it's 2/3 milk line. We'd start chopping on this date. Everybody had their own rule of thumb for what was their trigger to start their harvest. The issue is that corn breeding has gotten very specific and very accurate, especially over the past 10 to 15 years. So a lot of times our corn breeders breed and select traits for different characteristics. But one thing that's really changed a lot is the emphasis on stay green for hybrids, because we realize that the better stay green, the longer grain fill period we have. And then the other thing too is the way that we select genetics to encourage that ear to dry down too. So sometimes you'll see later on in the season, the tip of that husk starts to kind of open up on the ear, and that way any moisture that's in the ear can kind of wick out and evaporate. Between those two things, what we see now is a difference in the rate at which the plant dries down versus the rate at which the ear dries down. So rules of thumb that worked in the past with specific hybrids, I don't think they work very well anymore, just because of the way that corn breeding has changed in the past, especially in the recent past. When we try to increase ear dry down so that way we can save on drying costs, if we're using a grain-based hybrid for chopping corn, and then also, like I said, that difference in the stay green and how long we're trying to get that plant to retain its photosynthetic factory later and later into the growing season. And then if we start using fungicides, that changes everything entirely, right? If we keep the plant alive longer by adding fungicides, that's a whole nother level to this equation. And quite frankly, that makes this growing degree day prediction even more difficult. So if I back up a little bit more, I'll say that growing degree days is a nice start, but it doesn't solve anything. That's why we still go out to the field, take our samples, chip them and dry them out. Especially in a year like 2024, if we get into regions that didn't have any kind of ear development at all, more of these rules of thumb, the conventional wisdom doesn't apply, because we're missing half that plant, we're missing half that dry matter. The moisture curve isn't going to behave the same as if we had a well-eared plant.
It's something that we talked about earlier this week with Joe Lawrence as well, and he mentioned just the diversity. We were talking specifically about plant populations, and he talked about the diversity of varieties out there, and silage varieties out there. There's so much diversity nowadays. Breeding, as he mentioned, has changed a lot, and he would lean on what do the brand reps say about populations, and that's a good start. So it's kind of similar to what you're saying. There's just so much diversity out there that you have to do take some of these measurements yourself. So I think we're probably good to wrap it up here. Justin, do you have any last questions on the silage piece of this?
No, I think I learned what a growing degree day was. I learned that at 1800 growing degree days, we should start chopping and checking our corn that we're going to dry down to see what pace it's on. And that's really where we start with this, because there's so many other factors that are going to affect the dry down. We can watch this report that's coming out, and that's going to give us kind of an idea where to check regionally. But as Zach said, the best way to do it is to do it on your farm with your hybrid under your set of conditions. And so I think that's what I learned, and I think that's the takeaway from this.
Well, that's great. I mean, we've been trying to teach you growing degree days for years, so I'm glad Zach was finally able to pull it off. Finally, in all these years of agronomy, we figured this out. And for our viewers, this is a really important thing to watch, and especially for corn. Corn's really cool because it does follow these growing degree days. As Heidi mentioned earlier, soybean there is very dynamic and doesn't follow these as much, but it is a tool we can really use specifically for corn and to some extent for predicting how soybean will grow. So with that, I think we can end this episode here. I want to thank our listeners for sticking in with us here, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as me and Justin did. And we'll see you again for another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast.